Good afternoon. Want to welcome you all to another week in our course on early Christianity after the period of the New Testament. I'm Dr. Blumell, and I look forward to talking about this important period with you for the next 60 minutes. Believe it or not, we are just now passing the halfway point of the term, and still lots of material to cover as we work our way up until the early 4th century. And so without much further ado, because there's a lot of material I want to try to cover and introduce today, I want to jump right into the material. And so let's just turn and get right into things. And so on the schedule today, we're going to be discussing early Christian groups. Now, we're not quite there yet. We're going to spend the first few minutes here talking about early Christian Gospels and their importance. But by talking about early Christian Gospels, that will actually lead us into a discussion of early Christian groups. Because as we'll see, in fact, some early Christian groups will actually produce their own Gospels. And so we're going to learn something about these groups from the texts that they produce. So just to recap where we ended off last week. Last week we talked about the early Christian Gospels that we know that were extant in the first couple of centuries. Believe it or not, even after the 2nd century, Gospels and texts like that are still being written by Christians. But let me just make a couple points about these texts, and then we're going to return and we're going to talk about the Proto-Evangelium of James, which we talked about a little bit last week. I want to finish that off and talk a little bit more about the purpose of the text and why that was written. But one of the big points I want to make about this material that you see here is that it's widely agreed upon in scholarship. This material, in most cases, isn't actually telling us what Jesus and the early 12 disciples were actually doing or thinking. It's not inconceivable that a story or a saying that, was actually made by Jesus and was right there at the beginning, right, the formation of the church, has somehow found its way into one of these texts. But by and large, I think it's fairly safe to say that a lot of these Gospels are really addressing later issues. In fact, one of the trends we can see in these Gospels is that they tend to fill in gaps that you don't find in the canonical Gospels. For example, in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, these are the only two Gospels that you have infancy narratives, which means they talk about the birth of Jesus. And even though they tell us something of the birth of Jesus, there are still many details that we are unaware of. What you're going to find in some of these apocryphal Gospels is it tends to elaborate on details of Jesus' childhood. Again, let's just think back to the canonical Gospels for a moment. We have basically the birth of Jesus. You then have in Luke chapter 2 one story where it talks about him and his parents going down at the time of Passover to the temple. Right, his parents return, he's kind of lost, and then they find him in the temple with the doctors and experts of the law asking him questions. And then you literally turn to the next couple of verses in Luke, and all of a sudden he's about 30 years of age. And so really there's not much known in the canonical Gospels about Jesus' childhood. This might be because maybe the actual apostles didn't know a lot about his childhood. After all, they weren't there. Or maybe they knew more about his childhood, but thought with the limited space they were going to use for writing, wanted to focus on what was most important was his ministry. But one of the things you find in these later Gospels is, and some, a greater emphasis on his childhood, trying to fill in details, things like this. And in other Gospels, we'll talk about maybe filling in some details about teachings that he had or mysteries that he taught. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. So with that being said, let me just say a couple words then about the Proto-Evangelium of James, which literally just means the proto-gospel of James. In this gospel, it's going to narrate, right, the birth of Jesus. And there's going to be lots of similarities between what you find here and what you'll find occasionally in Matthew and Luke. Well, this gospel is a little bit different in the sense that it begins not with the birth of Jesus, or like Luke does, right, with the birth of John the Baptist, but actually begins with the birth of Mary, Jesus' mother. It wants to make the point that, in fact, Mary's birth, right, had there were divine happenings going on. It talks about her mother Anne, her father Joachim, right? Picking up on kind of a typical Old Testament story where it often talks about, a couple who are getting older and they don't have children. And this was the case alleged with Mary's parents. They go to the temple, they entreat the Lord, and they're then promised, right, they will have a child, and then they have Mary. And what you get in this gospel is that at a young age, Mary is then dedicated to the temple. And this really kind of picks up a lot on what you see in Samuel. Right? The author wants to make the point that from the very early age, people recognized there was something different about Mary, and so she was there as a child dedicated to the temple. Now, of course, this is completely anachronistic and against what we know about what's actually going on in the temple, where women weren't serving in the Levitical priesthood, but the story is describing this. And so I think it's pretty clear the author might know a little bit about what happened in the temple. Again, keep in mind that the temple had been destroyed in August of AD 70, and so this Proto-Evangelium of James written sometime 75 or 100 years later, the temple hadn't been around, and so you might expect some of these anachronisms. But anyway, the story is she's serving there, and then when she's about 12 years old, it's determined by the Sanhedrin that she should be given as a ward to Joseph. So she's given to Joseph, and Joseph kind of leaves her at home. One of the things that's interesting about this gospel that I mentioned last week is this is the first time you get in any early Christian writing that, in fact, Joseph was previously married. In fact, he was a widower, and that the half-brothers and sisters, right, of Jesus were from another spouse. In much later Christianity, certainly by the 4th century, this becomes really an important belief, right, as Christians later on will really focus on the perpetual virginity of Mary. But it's not really there at all in the beginning, right? When you read the Gospels, whether it's Matthew or Luke, but certainly even Mark, it's very clear that, in fact, Mary has other children. But anyway, in this Gospel, right, it wants to make the point that, in fact, no, Jesus was the only one. We're going to talk a bit more about this, because one of the things it wants to make really crystal clear in this Gospel is that Mary was always this pure virgin, and that any accusation against her of impropriety, and here dealing with this issue of sexuality, she was totally beyond reproach. In fact, she never, right, consummated the marriage with Joseph at any time. Right? Matthew and Luke just assume this would happen at some point. That's very clear. And so we're going to get to why this gospel wants to focus on this so much. And so when it turns out that Mary is pregnant, Joseph is aghast. It talks about, right, the high priest, the Sanhedrin being aghast. They test Mary and they find out, in fact, that it is a miraculous birth, right? It's a virgin birth. And the story goes on. Eventually, right, Mary will give birth to Jesus. And it has an added story that when she's giving birth to Jesus, it makes a note here, right? This takes place actually in a cave in Bethlehem, caves where you would have kept animals. It makes a point that the midwife who comes along with another woman to help with the delivery are, surprised that, in fact, that she is a virgin. In fact, even inspect her. And one woman does this by touching her, at which point her hand is withered. Because how dare they challenge that this person wasn't actually a virgin at this birth, and then by touching the infant Jesus that she then is healed. So that's kind of some of these stories that are then added to this. Now, a couple stories that I just want to mention here that also appear in this gospel that I think you might find a little bit interesting, and maybe I can clarify something in the Gospels, is this is the first time it talks about the killing of Zacharias. Now, as we all know from the Gospel of Luke, we're told that John the Baptist's dad was Zacharias. And we know from Matthew, for example, right, that when Jesus is born, not long thereafter, Herod issues, right, a decree or an edict of sorts, right, having children in the vicinity of Bethlehem from ages 2 years and under, right, being put to death, at which point in Matthew, right, Jesus and his family go into Egypt for a time. Well, what this then Proto-Evangelium of James does is it says, in fact, that Herod pulls in Zacharias, right, the father of John the Baptist, interrogates him regarding his son. Where is he in the story that's given here? And it tries to connect this with Luke, right, that talks about John the Baptist, right, growing up in the wilderness, being a wild man, living on locusts and honey, was basically in hiding in the Judean wilderness because of this decree of Herod. This is how the story then understands this. And then talks about because Zacharias will not reveal the whereabouts of his son John the Baptist, that he then has him put to death. And so this is what the story then reports. Now, let's just look back at the Gospels for a moment, because in fact, you do have a reference there to a Zacharias. This is in Matthew chapter 23, verses 34 and 35. And the context of this, we're going to connect this now to this Gospel, is Jesus here is speaking now to the scribes and Pharisees. And in the chapter before this, Jesus has been in the temple. It's the last week of his life. And there's kind of been these escalating tensions going on, right? Where they're questioning him. They're challenging his authority. They're trying to trip him up and make people not believe this could possibly be Messiah, that he couldn't possibly be the one. And then in chapter 23, he says some really strong words against the scribes and the Pharisees, right? Calling them children of the devil and things like this. These are not typically things we think of Jesus doing, but he has some really strong words for them. And look what he says here in verses 34 and 35 in Matthew 23. Wherefore, behold, I send unto you prophets and wise men and scribes, and some of them ye shall kill and crucify, and some of them shall ye scourge in your synagogues, and persecute them from city to city, that upon you may come all the righteous blood shed upon the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel unto the blood of Zacharias, son of Barachias, whom you slew between the temple and the altar. So clearly, what the Proto-Evangelium of James is doing is it's saying this Zacharias who got killed was the father of John the Baptist. But in fact, when you read this reference carefully, Jesus is not referring here to the father of John the Baptist, okay? Here he talks about Zacharias, son of Barachias, and he says, he was the one that you slew between the temple and the altar. Well, if you go back in the Old Testament, there is a Zacharias, and he's the only one who gets actually slain right in front of the temple, right before the altar. And this is Zacharias, son of Jehoiada. And this story occurs in 2 Chronicles chapter 24, and it's verses 20 to 22, where he gets killed there, right, while he is officiating at the temple. Now, there is a Zacharias, son of Barachias, but this is actually the prophet Zechariah. I think it's pretty clear in our manuscript of Matthew this is not accurate. So really Jesus is talking about here Zacharias, son of Jehoiada, who you killed. And one of the things to understand this reference in Matthew, which the Proto-Evangelium of James has erroneously picked up on and tried to answer, was what does he mean here saying that you've killed this Zacharias? Because this Zacharias, son of Jehoiada, had lived, right, many, many centuries earlier. But the point Jesus is making here is he's saying, look, scribes and Pharisees, you who are, right, attacking me, you're the kind of people that historically went after the righteous of God, you persecuted, and in some cases you even killed them. You're like those people. And he says, right, that the blood of Abel might come upon you, all the way down until, right, this blood of Zechariah, right, it says son of Barachias, but really it's son of Jehoiada, who you slew between the temple and the altar. And something to understand this reference, and it's clearly not to John the Baptist's father, you need to understand, is the ordering of, right, we'd say the Old Testament, they'd say the Hebrew Bible, or the word, that's used today is the Tanakh, which is the Torah, the writings, or the prophets and the writings, is the way that that was organized is, of course, the first book was Genesis. In our Old Testament today, the last book's Malachi, but in fact, their last book was 2 Chronicles, the way it was ordered. So what Jesus is saying, look, the blood of the righteous, from the very first one who gets killed, well, who's the first righteous person who dies in the Old Testament? Well, that's Abel, right, Genesis 4. All the way down to the blood of the last righteous person who it talks about. Well, guess what? In this ordering, when you end with 2 Chronicles, guess who's the very last righteous person getting killed? Well, Zacharias, son of Jehoiada. He's saying all that blood will be upon you because you're the kind of people that would have carried out these things. And so that reference there does not refer to his dad, although this proto-gospel does this. So again, I think it tells a hint, right? The person who's doing this is trying to fill in a gap, but in this case, we can say they clearly fill it in wrong here. Now, something I want to mention here about this text is it has a really strong emphasis on Mary's virtue and purity, right? And this emphasis that she was always a virgin. In fact, even Joseph had kids from another marriage. And this seems to be addressing something that's going on, and it really begins to pick up in the later 2nd century. I think we can kind of connect this and help us understand this period a little bit better. As I mentioned, right, in the last few lectures, that as you get into, right, the late 1st or the beginning of the 2nd century, right, there's lots of rumors circulating about Christians, right? They're immoral people, right? They might even practice cannibalism and all kinds of things. And so you have apologists who will write saying, look, this is not what we do. In fact, here are the activities we engage in. But as you get into the later part of the 2nd century, for the first time now, you get entire treatises written against Christians, and you get now the rise of anti-Christian literature. And so I want to talk just a little bit about the rise of anti-Christian literature, because I think this gospel, in part, is addressing some of this, okay? So as Christianity begins to spread in the 2nd century, you find some non-Christians are attacking it. And I think they quickly realize that, in fact, Christians aren't going right and killing people and doing these, untoward actions that might at least exist out there at the popular level. And so what these anti-Christian treatises do is they begin to really attack Christians on a more philosophical level. It's very clear that anti-Christian writers begin to read the Gospels and to begin to try to poke holes or try to show problems or contradictions in them. And the earliest extant anti-Christian treatise that we have, and by the way, you have really from antiquity, there are basically, we know of, 3 major anti-Christian treatises. One was written in the 2nd century, one was written in the 3rd century, one was written in the 4th century. Probably there were others written, but these seem to be the big ones. But the first one that we know of was written by a philosopher called Celsus. And again, I'm going to show how this kind of, I think, relates back to the Proto-Evangelium of James. He wrote a work called The True Doctrine, and he was a Neoplatonic philosopher of the 2nd century. And he wrote this doctrine where he tried to basically say, I'm going to disprove the claims of the Christians. And what's interesting is this writing is no longer extant. In fact, no anti-Christian writings are extant. In large part, they were burned, near as we can tell, right? We've had edicts later on in the 4th century when Christianity has imperial support. But the way these things have been preserved is that Christians would write apologies against them, and they would then quote the writing and then give a defense, quote the writing, right, give a defense or rebuttal. And so by removing the response, you can basically figure out the contours of what these writers were saying. And so Celsus writes this book, and it was then responded to. There's 2 other later texts by Porphyry and Julian. We might talk about those a little later this term. But one of the points Celsus wants to make is he really wants to attack Jesus, and he has a number of ad hominem attacks against Jesus, and he has a number of ad hominem attacks against Mary. And when you go and you read this text, as you see here right at the beginning, the first 2 quotes here on this slide, is he wants, more than anything else, he wants to impugn the credibility of Mary and say, look, in fact, she was an adulteress, and he gives all these accusations against her. Right? In fact, she went and she cheated on Joseph. She committed adultery with a Roman soldier, right, called Pantera. Jesus was nothing but, right, a magician. He went to Egypt to learn, tricks, magic, and all these things. It's interesting, right? Think about what he's saying here. When I read this treatise of Celsus, and I read, right, certain, aspects of anti-Mormon literature. Well, Joseph, right, he came from an immoral family, right? They were involved in magic and money digging and all this stuff. Well, guess what? Celsus beat them to the punch about Jesus by about 1,800 years. And so he says these things, and so he really wants to impugn the character of Mary, and especially that she was immoral. And this is why I think you get a gospel produced at this time saying, there is no way she could have been immoral. Look at her. She had this virginity throughout her life. And so I think when you think of this, right, the Proto-Evangelium of James, I think it's pretty clear that at least some of this is written in response to growing anti-Christian literature. And one of the big things that's going on now are attacks, not only on the character of Jesus, but also on Mary. In fact, we know from Justin, for example, we talked about before, he has a dialogue with Trypho. He has this dialogue in which he has a debate with a Jewish interlocutor about Christianity, Jesus being the Messiah. And one of the things that comes very clear is that, again, there's an accusation of infidelity on the part of Mary. So I think we can, account for this strong vein in this gospel here. Just to make another note here about anti-Christian literature, you will find, right, as it kind of progresses over the centuries, it does become more refined, and Christians will respond to this. But for me, as I read some of the arguments I said before, made against Jesus, and I read, anti-Mormon literature at times about, stories about Joe Smith, immorality, magic, my response is, again, well, there's really nothing new under the sun. And so it's really quite interesting taking a look at this. But really, at least we know, really it's late 2nd century. Now, with that being said, I want to talk about just a couple other early Christian gospels, because it's going to help us understand a little bit more about early Christian groups. So we've talked about, right, the Proto-Evangelium of James. I want to talk about this quote-unquote secret gospel of Mark, just for a few minutes. In some circles of scholarships, it's rather controversial, but I think it's quite interesting what little we know about this. And so I want to mention just what we know about this text. And this will then lead us into a discussion of a couple other apocryphal Gospels. So the story behind this Gospel is that there was a scholar, an American scholar named Morton Smith, who taught for much of his career at Columbia. In 1958, he went and he was working on sabbatical at the Mar Saba Monastery, which is in the Judean desert. This is about 45 minutes or so outside of Jerusalem, there in the Judean wilderness, right? This is an old Christian monastery, right, that goes back 1,000+ years. And they had, right, a library with various manuscripts. So he spent time there cataloging manuscripts, working through the library. And he reports that while he was reading and working through a manuscript that contained the Apostolic Fathers, he came to the very end of a book, and you see here, right, it's written, right, you have this Latin commentary here, but this is on the Epistle of Barnabas, which is one of the writings of the Apostolic Fathers. He reports, he said, at the very end, on the last few pages, there was this text written in Greek. And it's intrigued him, right? This was in a printed book. The book was probably, they figure, from about the 17th century, but then had this handwritten note that went on for a couple pages. And so it's intrigued him. He wanted to know what this was. And as he began to translate this purportedly preserved a letter from a 2nd century Christian called Clement. Now, we talked about one Clement, right, that early letter from the Apostolic Fathers. Clement, right, is a fairly common name. But we know a very important Christian writer called Clement of Alexandria from Egypt. He wrote in the latter part of the 2nd century, beginning of the 3rd century. He wrote various works. Some of them are still extant. And so purportedly now there was an extract that was made from a copy of a letter this Clement had written to some disciple called Theodorus. And it's really quite fascinating. And he then reported on this. And so as he translated this letter, let me just give the context for this. So there is a Christian, right? So the letter apparently is dated to the 2nd century. Now, when I say it's dated to the 2nd century, this letter, of course, is not 2nd century. It's much, much later. But apparently it's from a copy of a copy of a copy. If you go back, then the original version would have been written by Clement, who was writing in the 2nd century. And what the story is given in this letter is this Theodorus, right, had asked Clement about a group of Christians, right, called Carpocratians. And we'll talk about Carpocrates and Gnostics. They're a Christian group. We'll get there in a few minutes' time. But he had heard that they were claiming that there were certain things and stories that were reported in the Gospel of Mark. And as far as he could tell, they weren't actually present in the Gospel of Mark. And they were using these to support certain of their esoteric doctrines. And this kind of troubled Theodorus. So he wrote Clement and said, Clement, is there anything to these stories that these people are saying, that these stories are in the Gospel of Mark? Because I have never written this. And Clement then gives this very interesting response. He says, well, don't ever admit, right, to this group what's in there. But what Clement goes on, he says, well, let me tell you, Theodorus, in fact, if you look at the second paragraph, it says, well, Mark came, right? The tradition of Christianity is that Mark, after being in Rome with Peter, goes to Alexandria, right? This is the church, story that he starts the church in Alexandria. And he says, right, eventually he does this, right, to the Gospel of Mark. And Clement then says, well, Mark just wrote a really basic gospel that were going to be useful for those who were really, right, like neophytes or newly converted. He says, however, Mark also produced another gospel that was really only written for other people that included more of the teachings of Jesus, but they were far, far deeper and really, related to, right, these kind of higher mysteries of the kingdom of God. And he says, yes, there is one story in this copy of Mark. So what we're learning here, if this letter is accurate, is that in fact there are various copies of the Gospel of Mark, and one of them was only for members who were kind of initiated in the quote-unquote mysteries of the kingdom of heaven. And he says that this story, the particular one that Theodorus had a question about, in our Gospel of Mark, he talks about, right, this story, right, about Jesus, right, going on the road to Jerusalem, right, talking about, right, prophesying of his death and resurrection. And so this would be equivalent of our Mark about 10:34. He says, after this point in the Gospel, this story actually exists in Mark. Before then it returns to what we have as Mark 10:35. So it's quite fascinating. Let's just look what he says here, the story that was purportedly in this version of Mark. And so he says this. He says, this is what's actually in this copy, but he says, don't admit this to these people. He says, quote, "And they come into Bethany," right, Jesus and disciples, "and a certain woman whose brother had died was there." Now you're probably thinking, okay, who does this sound like? Well, this is Lazarus. It sounds like there is some other version, perhaps, of the story of Lazarus, right? This is in John 11, but maybe this is in some early version of Mark, right? Presuming this is accurate. And it says, "And coming, she prostrated herself before Jesus and says to him, 'Son of David, have mercy on me.' But the disciples rebuked her, and Jesus, being angered, went off with her into the garden where the tomb was, and straightway a great cry was heard from the tomb. And going near Jesus, rolled away the stone from the door of the tomb, and straightway going in where the young man was, he stretched forth his hand and raised him, seizing his hand." So this sounds like the Lazarus story. So he goes into Bethany, he does this. And then look what it says here. Because this is what, Theodorus wants to know about some of these esoteric teachings this group is purporting took place. He says, "But the young man looking upon him loved him," right? This is the word, agape, right? It's kind of, you had this profound love toward Jesus, right? "And began to beseech him that he might be with him. And going out of the tomb, they came into the house of the young man, for he was rich. And after 6 days, Jesus told him what to do. And in the evening, the young man comes to him, wearing a linen cloth over his naked body. And he remained with him that night, for Jesus taught him the secret of the kingdom of God. And thence arising, he returned to the other side of the Jordan." This is an interesting story. This young man being initiated in some kind of secret, wearing nothing but a linen cloth, and then Jesus then moving on. And Clement says, yes, this story does actually exist in this other version of the Gospel of Mark, but don't admit it to these people. Now, this is really interesting because some have wondered, well, is this authentic, right? Does Morton Smith really have this document? People have looked at it. It does seem like a very Clementine document. But if it's, accurate, then it seems, right, there's more than one copy of the Gospel of Mark. And so this would be something interesting, that maybe we have a story that had been lost from this secret Gospel of Mark that talks about Jesus initiating this young man, Lazarus, in some kind of higher teaching at some point, right, during his ministry. And so I think it's rather interesting, and at least just worth mentioning there. And certainly the details around its discovery are really quite interesting, and in some ways controversial, even to this day in scholarship. Now, let me just say a couple words about a few of these other early Christian Gospels. Then I'm going to talk about that group, the Gnostics I had talked about, or at least I'd mentioned when talking about the secret Gospel of Mark. One of the things you find is that there, and none of these are extant, by the way, is allegedly in the 2nd century, there were a number of what we might say maybe Jewish Gospels. What I mean by Jewish Gospels is Gospels written by Judaizers, or those who wrote Gospels about Jesus that maintained that Christians ought to follow the law. And so you have references to the Gospel of the Hebrews, Gospel of the Ebionites, Gospel of the Nazarenes, right, Gospel of the Egyptians. None of these Gospels exist today. We only know them from scattered references that maybe a church father like Irenaeus will mention something, or Origen or Justin will mention something, and that's all that we know about them. But what's important here that I want to talk about is leads us to a discussion of early Christian groups. Because one of the things we find here, certainly in the 2nd century and in the 3rd century, is there is not just one group of Christians. In fact, there are many different groups of Christians. And while they might have common beliefs, a lot of them have very, very different beliefs. In fact, I would argue that when you get into the 2nd century, even in the 3rd century, it might not be unlike Christianity today, where when somebody talks about being a Christian today, you'll say, okay, well, there's some kind of veneration for Jesus Christ, right? There would certainly be, right, probably some attachment to the New Testament. But then beyond that, there could be some very significant differences, right? When you think about Protestants, Catholics, like Latter-day Saints, Pentecostals, right? Seventh-day Adventists, Jehovah's Witnesses, the list goes on and on, Orthodox. There's kind of something that binds them together. There's some really serious, significant differences. Well, it's pretty clear we're finding some of this in the 2nd century. And so as we talk about some of these groups, one of these groups, we're going to kind of lump them together, seems to be that we have in the 2nd century, and early Christians are talking about this, but there seems to be an important focus of groups located around, right, what we might call Jewish Christianity, or early Christian groups in the 2nd century saying, okay, we're going to follow, right, Jesus, but we're going to insist that you have to still follow the law. And if you know your New Testament very well, one of the things you're going to know really soon, once you get into the book of Acts, is a debate's going to come up. And it's not going to be entirely answered, although Paul's letters will kind of wade into this, but it kind of comes up is, well, is the law still in force? And if not, okay, are parts of it in force? Or if it is in force, what should we still follow? So one of the big issues that comes up in the early church, for example, at least as it's told in the New Testament, is the issue of circumcision. And let's just give this some context. So in the early church, think here, right? Jesus' ministry is only among Israelites, okay? But eventually, right, when Jesus dies in the book of Acts, right, he's going to tell the apostles, saying, okay, wait here in Jerusalem, wait for the promise, right, the Holy Ghost, that comes in Acts chapter 2, but he also says, I want you to take this gospel to the very ends of the earth. And so at some point, the early church then decides, well, this is not just going to be an Israelite movement. In fact, we're going to take this to Gentiles and others. But of course, that brings in some problems because these people had never followed the law. So one of the big issues that comes up in the book of Acts is when a Gentile wants to join the church, at least we're dealing with males here, do they need to be circumcised? And in Acts 15 at the Jerusalem Council, or when you read Galatians or Romans 4, it's very clear that no, they do not need to be circumcised. In fact, circumcision is part of the Old Covenant. But what you're finding here in some Jewish Christian groups in the 2nd century is they're insisting on circumcision, saying, no, you need to do this. And so we know some of these groups, just by references from other Christians saying, look, you need to be circumcised. And these groups also then would disagree with Paul, right? With Paul's letters, Romans, Galatians, very forcefully making the case saying circumcision is no longer part of the new covenant. But what we're finding in Christianity is there is a vein within this of Jews saying, okay, we're going to accept Jesus as the Messiah, but we still, for example, think you need to be circumcised, and we think you still need to make sacrifice. And so some of these groups might insist on this. And so you're finding, right, then some differentiation where some Christians say, no, the law is done away with, circumcision is no longer required, sacrifice has been done away with. Well, other Christians might be saying, no, we're still going to circumcise. We're still going to follow the law of Moses, but we'll accept that Jesus was the fulfillment, right, and was the Messiah. And so this is what you're finding some of this, different groups, at least dealing with Jewish Christianity in the 2nd century. And what's apparent here is that this group would even, right, they've kind of even created some of their own gospels. And at least from the quotes from these gospels, they kind of appear to depict Jesus very much following the law, and then using this as a precedent saying, look, we likewise need to then follow the law. He did not do away with the law altogether. And these groups then might reject, right, writings of Paul and things like this. As we're going to see, in fact, one notable group in the 2nd century only likes Paul's letters. In fact, will reject other aspects that become a part of the New Testament. And so you have kind of, right, Jewish Christianity and groups that kind of espouse this in the 2nd century. Again, just think back to a moment for the letters of Ignatius of Antioch. He warns about Judaism and circumcision, because Christians were doing this. And so there were kind of these, Judaizers, people clamoring for this. And so we certainly see this as kind of a subgroup within broader Christianity in the 2nd century. Now, they are not by no means the only subgroup. There are a variety of subgroups here under the umbrella of Christian. And so let's then talk about some of these other groups. So we talked about Jewish Christianity just very briefly. And to learn about these other groups, we have to return to the apologists, right? So we've talked about Christian apologists, right, Justin and others. Well, much as some of these people were apologists, they were also what is called heresiologists. And what a heresiologist is, think of the word heresy, is they would actually write about some of these other Christian groups and saying, this other Christian group is not practicing the faith right, they hold false doctrines, and they have false beliefs and false practices. And so it actually then critique these other groups. And so you're going to find writings now that begin to emerge in the 2nd century where a Christian writer will take it upon themselves to now write about another group and talk about what they are doing wrong. Now, the earliest text that we have, or at least that we know about, we don't actually have it, is Justin wrote a work, right, called the Syntagma, kind of an ordering, kind of talking about, right, other groups and talking about what the true Christian faith was. So already in the 2nd century, we're having debates over who are the true disciples of Jesus? What is the true faith? This work is no longer extant. We have a couple references from this from later writers, but is missing. But as you can see here, others, write something similar. And of course, this goes right into, right, the 4th and 5th centuries, right, with, Augustine writing, right, a very large work against heresies. We have a 4th century bishop, Epiphanius of Salamis, that's in Cyprus, writing a huge book on various heresies. Again, some of the things in these books you always have to be careful of. And I would always say this as a good historian, right? You always have to be very careful when you're learning about one group from their opponents. I think it's very clear in the news today, right? When you learn about another group from their opponents, I think you always got to take it with a grain of salt. So you got to be aware of this, but we learn about other Christian groups from those who are writing against them. So what I want to talk about here is our very first extant text, right, a heresiological text. And this is by a Christian called Irenaeus, and he writes a work against heresies in the latter part of the 2nd century, and it has survived. Right, we have a Latin translation. Originally it was in Greek, but for most part it survived in Latin. But it's a really interesting text because it's going to talk about one of these early Christian groups that was very dominant in the 2nd and even into the 3rd century. So let me just say a couple words then about Irenaeus. So he seems to have been born sometime about 130 to 140 and was a native of Asia Minor. And one of the things that we learn about him, and this is really quite interesting, is he says that in fact he personally knew Polycarp. Now remember we talked about Polycarp a couple of weeks ago. Polycarp was this early bishop, right, in Smyrna, who we know was martyred and put to death. We also know that Ignatius, sometime around about 110, wrote him a letter as bishop. And in fact, Polycarp, at least according to Irenaeus and others, actually even crossed some paths with some of the original apostles. That's the story anyway. And so Irenaeus claims to have known Polycarp. And Irenaeus, right, eventually, right, ends up in Lyon or Lugdunum, right, in Gaul or modern-day France. We know that, in fact, he will actually relocate to Rome for a time, but eventually will come back to Lyon, and there will be made a bishop. And that's where he kind of spends out the remainder of his days in the 2nd century there as bishop. And he wrote a couple of important works that have been preserved. So the one work he writes, right, is this Against Heresies that I want to talk about, because he's going to talk about a Christian group. And again, we have to take with a grain of salt what he's saying about this group. Does very nice things to say. But we learn an awful lot about them from this treatise. He writes another work called The Demonstration of the Apostolic Preaching, talking about, well, what did the apostles actually preach? This work is no longer extant in the original language, but there is an Armenian translation, surviving in Armenian, that probably preserves in large part, right, what he had actually written in this treatise. And so let's talk about this work, right, Against Heresies that he writes. Now this work is primarily directed against what is known as Gnosticism. Okay, so we're going to talk about Gnosticism. In fact, there's a subgroup of Christians called Gnostics. And they really are troubling to Irenaeus and others, and so they will attack their beliefs. And so we'll talk about what they believe, and specifically, he's really troubled about Valentinian Gnosticism. And Valentinus, according to Irenaeus, was an early convert to the church from Egypt, who then began to propound various doctrines that had to do with gnosis or knowledge and say, this is the core of the Christian faith. This is the core of what's important for salvation. So let's talk about what Irenaeus is saying about this group, and it will tell us something about, right, another subgroup within Christianity here in the 2nd century. And we actually do have a few extant treatises from this group that at least introduce here momentarily. So maybe you've heard of Gnostics or Gnosticism before. In fact, there is a veiled reference here in one of the pastorals by Paul, where it says, beware, the King James translates, beware of so-called knowledge, so-called science, but it's actually so-called knowledge, or that which is falsely called knowledge. And the word for knowledge in Greek is gnosis. Okay? So this group, right, they get dubbed, right, the Gnostics because their focus on knowledge. And what they claim here was most important about what Jesus did is they'll say he conveyed a divine knowledge. And he was a revealer of this, and what you want to have is his knowledge. And this knowledge is what will truly set you free from this world. Now, what's interesting here, as we read right into Irenaeus and others, is you might say, okay, Jesus has this knowledge that he conveys that will help bring you salvation. But what they then say is, hey, look, this death and resurrection, or what we would talk about as atonement, they say, look, this is nothing. Atonement is irrelevant for salvation. It's just the divine knowledge that, in fact, that he conveyed. That's what will actually free you. And so this is very troubling to some of these early Christian writers, where they basically say the death and resurrection aren't important. In fact, we know that some Gnostic writers will say, we don't even believe he actually suffered or died. In fact, let me just go back to the New Testament for a moment, because we might have the beginnings of this when you read 1 John and 2 John, the epistles of John. There, John warns about antichrists, those who deny that Jesus has come, what? In the flesh. And I talked about this group here a couple of weeks ago, where there was some thinking, right, that gods don't have bodies, right? Divine beings can't suffer, can't bleed, can't do all these things. Therefore, Jesus could never have had a body, could not have suffered, couldn't have actually died. And these kind of seem to be bundled up with what Gnostics will then assert, is, these things couldn't really happen. So what's most important really is the knowledge that he conveyed, but it's an esoteric knowledge. And so often what they'll have is kind of this mysterious knowledge that only really those who are really initiated into what they're teaching will know about this, and that's what will liberate them. Now, when we think about Gnosticism, they kind of have this, they'll lay out kind of a plan, right, for, how do you escape this evil world? They'll look at, materiality, generally speaking, is quite negative light. Therefore, you're not looking at really a physical resurrection, but more just a spiritual resurrection or spiritual afterlife. Again, diminishing, right, the acts of Jesus as opposed to what his sayings were. And they put much more emphasis on this. And one of the things we learn about this group, right, when I talk Gnostics, in academia today we talk about Gnostics, but we quickly realize there's a number of groups within this general umbrella that might talk about this knowledge or esoteric knowledge that Jesus conveyed, but they might have a number of different ways of looking at this and all understand it a little bit different. But one of the things we learn about this group, and this is from Irenaeus, but even from others, is that to communicate their teachings about Jesus and this hidden knowledge that he conveyed is they then produced a number of Gospels. Okay, and one of the allegations made by Irenaeus or others is these Gospels don't go back to the original 12. It's very clear these Gospels were written in our own day. And so one of the important Gospels that we're told about that this group had that really conveyed their beliefs and kind of encapsulated it, right, rather succinctly, was what was known as the quote-unquote Gospel of Truth. This is the truth that was really going to set you free, right? This is really devoid of an atonement or resurrection. Here is this knowledge you need to know to be, right, set free. And this is really, right, to obtain salvation, right, as you transcend this world. Now, what's really interesting is you have, of course, references to this. And so for a long time, people thought, well, this must have been an interesting text. But in fact, this text was actually discovered in 1945. So let me just talk about this. We're going to go back to that story then and talk more about the Gospel of Truth. In 1945, as the story goes, there was an Egyptian peasant, Muhammad Ali Saman, who was purportedly digging right at the base of a cliff, right? There were a lot of bird droppings there, kind of get fertilizer he was going to use for planting. And while digging, he reports, anyway, that he stumbled across 13 different codices that were buried there in the ground. Okay? Now, a codex is just a book. And so there's 13 different codices that had been buried there in the ground. And of course, this is kind of coming near the end of, World War II. Eventually, those obviously, this discovery was in large part overshadowed by the World War, but eventually it kind of came out, and it was realized the importance of these texts because they contained a number of Gnostic Gospels. And so as you can see from this slide here, you have here on these 13 different codices, as they've been translated, and again, they're overwhelmingly written in Coptic, which is a late form of Egyptian. It's kind of I kind of described it as kind of an Egyptian Greek, so to speak, where it uses all the letters of the Greek alphabet plus 6 additional letters from Demotic. It'll have a lot of Greek loan words, but also a lot of Egyptian words. So they're all preserved here in Coptic. It's widely agreed they date to around the 4th century. And all of a sudden now you have all these Gospels that previously, Irenaeus might have talked about or somebody else, and you now have these all right here. And as you can see here and here, it actually preserved 2 copies of the Gospel of Truth. This early Gospel, Irenaeus says these Gnostics adhered to, and was kind of one of their main texts they would then circulate. And so let me just talk and give you a couple extracts from this Gospel of Truth, just so you get a little bit of better idea of Gnosticism. And again, I do this in part because, Irenaeus is no impartial, historian. He says this group are heretics, they are wrong, they're fabricating things. And I think Irenaeus makes a lot of good points. All the same, I do think it's important to hear people speak for themselves. What do they adhere to? And so I think the Gospel of Truth kind of succinctly does this. And so here in the Gospel of Truth, it's so named because, in the very beginning it says this is the Gospel of Truth, The Gospel of Truth is joy to those who receive them from the Father of Truth, the gift of knowing Him by the power of the Logos. Well, the Logos here is the Greek word for the Word. So that's talking about Jesus, Who has come from the pleroma, which is the fullness, That's what people want to obtain. And as you get knowledge, you then go on to the fullness. You'll transcend this world and go on into the fullness. So it begins by, styling itself this way. And as you begin reading this gospel, it's not too long. It's much shorter than, the Gospel of Mark, for example. It begins by kind of giving, the Gnostic myth. Where the myth here, I'm not using this here in a derogative way, but more or less saying how the generation of air entered into the world. From the beginning, air entered in, and how then gnosis then entered in through the Logos. And how then you lay hold of that, knowledge then, so you can now enter the pleroma or this fullness, and be liberated and transcend the world. And so what you'll find here, there's lots of philosophical terms. Not only that, it will talk a lot about Sophia or wisdom, acquisition of wisdom and knowledge. And so then you'll have a passage, for example, talking about Jesus, Look what it says here. He came a guide, quiet and leisure. In the middle of a school, he came and spoke the word as a teacher. Those who are wise in their own estimation came to put him to the test, but he discredited them as empty-headed people. They hated him because they really were not wise men. After all these came also the little children, those who possessed the knowledge of the Father. When they became strong, they were taught the aspects of the Father's face. They came to know, and they were known. And so one of the things that he wants to make a point here is that really Jesus was mainly a revealer, Again, what you're going to find in these texts is really this idea of atonement, suffering, resurrection, really absent. It's just, he's a revealer. He's revealing knowledge. And that's what true disciples will get. And then these texts purportedly contain a lot of this esoteric knowledge that he actually allegedly taught the disciples. Again, I would say here, that when you read about these texts that talk about Jesus conveying this knowledge, I would say overwhelmingly this is very clearly a product of the 2nd century. Again, it's not maybe inconceivable. Some of this stuff could, in some form go back much earlier, but it's widely agreed, this kind of produced by Gnostics at that time. Now, what's interesting in this gospel, and you'll find this in other Gnostic gospels that are produced, is they will also include stories, or stories that are very similar to what you find in the Gospels. So, for example, in the Gospel of Truth, they'll have a story about, going out after the, leaving the 99 to go out and find the one. In Luke, this is going out and finding that one, the sinner, and bringing them back, and how important that one is. Well, the Gospel of Truth will talk about the story, but talk about it a little bit differently, where he's going to go out to give knowledge to that one. The 99 know it now, let's go and find that one, and let's convey knowledge to them. You'll likewise find, for example, in the Gospel of Truth, a saying that's very similar to what you find in Matthew chapter 12, verses 11 to 12. And so it's quite interesting. You'll find that they'll take a gospel story and kind of adapt it to their own purposes, and very often try to give, a more esoteric or maybe an allegorical interpretation that in some way will inform the readers more about the knowledge they need to obtain. And again, as I've mentioned before, Irenaeus is very frustrated about this, He'll talk about the gospels they've produced. And again, he'll talk about some gospels we still have never found. But it's interesting, we actually found some of these, that came out in the Nag Hammadi Gospels. Nag Hammadi texts, excuse me. Now, what's interesting here, and I think I should just mention this as we talk about, this kind of Gnostic group, which it seems to be at least somewhat dominant here in the 2nd century, is Irenaeus says, well, not only did this Gospel of Truth, but they even had this gospel called the Gospel of Judas. And Irenaeus is really frustrated. He says, look, in this Gospel of Judas, they say Judas was the only disciple who really knew the truth. Now, when you read the Gospels, right, we look at Jesus as the betrayer, right? Judas is the one that goes and hands him over, right, who goes then and takes his own life. And what the Gnostics do is they say, no, Judas does this because he really knew the truth. He wanted to liberate Jesus from this world. And so what this gospel does, it kind of flips it and says, he's the only one that really got it. Now look what Irenaeus says about this text. For this reason he brought about the mystery of the betrayal. Now he's talking about Judas. Through him all things on the earth and heaven were destroyed. They provide a work to this effect called the Gospel of Judas. Now I don't know if you remember this, but about 10 to 12 years ago, the Gospel of Judas was actually, it was discovered. It had been discovered much earlier, but it kind of came to general knowledge. It's written in Coptic. There you see a page of this. And again, if you remember this, about a decade ago, people were talking about Judas. Well, it's very clear this Gospel tells us absolutely nothing about the historical Judas, or very little. It's clearly talking about, right, Gnostic doctrines as they create, Gospels, and say, no, Judas was the only disciple who got it. The other ones didn't get it. But what's interesting now is formerly, right, we'd heard references about some Gospel of Judas floating around in the 2nd or 3rd century, and then it was discovered, and it's really quite remarkable. Now, unfortunately, it's fragmentary, right? We have large chunks of it, but as you can see from this page here, parts are missing. But it does again tell us a little bit more about Gnostic belief. So when you think about early Christian groups in the 2nd century, right, we have, right, Christians, right, Irenaeus, Justin. The term that's kind of used in modern scholarship is they'll say, well, these are kind of what we would call proto-Orthodox writers. They'll eventually be a Christian orthodoxy kind of established as Christianity kind of extends and certainly will have imperial support. But this group is not the only group of Christians in the 2nd century, right? You have, right, what you might call Jewish Christians. You have Gnostic Christians that will have their own beliefs. Let me now mention one other group here as we conclude the lesson for today. And let me talk about a very prominent Christian who we know very well, not a whole lot about, but played a very important role in the 2nd century and had yet another subgroup. And this person is called Marcion. And there's a group, right, of his followers are called Marcionites. And so let's talk about this individual and what he did in the 2nd century and why he was so important at this time in the history of early Christianity. So we learn about Marcion already from Justin. Justin actually knows Marcion in Rome. And so Justin will actually have a few references to Marcionites. And later Christian writers will talk about him. And again, just like the Gnostics, right, always take what they're saying with a grain of salt, because again, it's a very hostile depiction they give of this individual. But the story that's given of this individual is he was from Sinope, here in the province of Bithynia Pontus, which is rather interesting here. Because remember here the letters of Pliny? Pliny was in Bithynia Pontus in this area, talking about Christians there at the beginning of the 2nd century. And Marcion comes from this area. So I don't know if Marcion, maybe was a very young child, time of Pliny, maybe wasn't born yet. But I think it's interesting, right? It's kind of connected back to that same area. And the story that's given, and again, it may be hostile that Marcion, right, his father was a bishop. Initially he was good, but then he engaged in fornication, and then he left Sinope, and there he went to Rome. And it talks about Marcion being very wealthy, right? Allegedly he was a ship owner. And when he got to the church in Rome, right, he joined the church and gave this large donation to the church. And over time, initially, right, was welcomed and thought what a great addition to the Roman Church. But over time began teaching some very different beliefs. And eventually, according to early Christian writers, he was actually sometime around AD 44 excommunicated from the church in Rome, and his money was then given back to him. And so you begin to wonder, okay, why is Marcion, right, excommunicated from the church in Rome? Well, here's the story that's given. Is Marcion begins to teach, right? And by the way, he begins to also circulate writings. None of his writings survive, by the way. But we know that he wrote, the major work that he wrote, at least we know from early Christian writers, is he wrote a work called Antitheses. And what this work was about, basically, is saying, look, the Old and New Testament are completely different. And this led him to believe and then to preach, and this seems to be the basis for his excommunication, but a lot of people followed him, it seems, was he said, look, there is one God of the Old Testament, another God of the New Testament, and they are different gods. For him, he's saying you can't reconcile this. You can't reconcile the loving God, right, of Jesus in the New Testament with the God of the Old Testament. They're totally different. And so in this book that he wrote, he says, look, You have this violent, God of the Old Testament. You have a loving God of the New Testament. They couldn't possibly be the same. And so what he then equates this with, the God of the Old Testament, becomes known here as what's known as the demiurge, right? This kind of creator. So there's this God who went and created, right, this physical world. And then there was then another God, right, this good God, a spiritual God, who went and sent Jesus. And here's where I think you have some very clear overlaps probably with Gnosticism, probably influenced by this somewhat, who then brought this message of the good news or the gospel. And so Marcion said, basically, what we need to do as Christians is completely reject the entire Old Testament, reject the God of the Old Testament, and only follow, right, this good news, which is antithetical, hence this, antithesis, the title of the treatise, which is totally antithetical to the Old Testament. Now, a number of Christian writers said, no, this is not the case. It's the same God. So they didn't like the fact he's preaching two different gods, and the God of the Old Testament is a lower one, a malevolent God in some ways, and the God of the New Testament, right, was this benevolent, loving God. And so they didn't like at all what he was teaching there. But what this did, and this is where I think it's really quite significant, what he does here, is when you think of his teachings, because he rejected the law, he then says, and he's the first Christian we know to do this, he then proposes a New Testament canon. I don't know if you recall last week, I talked about, right, some early canon lists, where I talked about, well, there was Marcion, there's Irenaeus, right, there's the Muratorian canon, there's Eusebius, and we talked last week about Athanasius, this Alexandrian bishop who in AD 367 in the Easter letter said, here are the books that Christians should be reading as Scripture. And the point I was making there was that that's the first time the 27 books of the New Testament that we use today are actually listed together there. Well, Marcion had a very, diminished view of Scripture. He said, first of all, Christians don't use the Old Testament. It's written by a lower God, and so he completely said, altogether, get rid of that. What he also did is Marcion, we learn, is he said, because this world is bad, he says there's no way Jesus could have had a body. Therefore, Jesus just appeared as a spiritual being. So, we might say he had what we call a docetic view of Jesus. Jesus, this word dokeo in Greek means to seem or appear. Jesus only seemed or appeared to have a body, but in fact, he was just a spiritual apparition. Yes, he didn't have a body, only seemed to. He was not the Messiah sent by the, the old God, but he was sent by this other God. And as part of this, he says, well, there's certainly no virgin birth. Right? Jesus couldn't have had a body, because again, by having a body, it's somehow now connecting the good God with a corporeal badness that's part inherently of the work of the demiurge, the God of the Old Testament. So Jesus then, when we think about this, there was no miraculous birth, no virgin birth, there was no body. Well, if there's none of that, what then you have? Well, then there's no death, there's no resurrection, because he couldn't die. There's no suffering. So again, you find these kind of parallels with Gnosticism. Now what you're thinking here is saying, well, what does he do with the Gospels? Right? What do you do with the Gospel of Luke, the Gospel of Matthew, these things? Well, what we're told here, Marcion does, is he begins to promote his own canon of the Scripture. And what he does with certain Gospels is he only gives an adumbrated form of them. I mean, he totally cuts them down. So what we're told about Marcion, that he says, look, the only canons Christians should have, like in terms of scriptural canon, is they should have the Gospel of Luke and 10 letters of Paul, and that should be it. No Old Testament, nothing else. No other Gospels. Now, when you're wondering, what is this letter to the Laodiceans he's talking about? We do know from Paul's letter to the Colossians that, in fact, he also sent a letter to the church at Laodicea, which has since been lost. We don't have that. Apparently, Marcion was aware of that, right, and said, okay, we'll use this text there. Now, what's interesting here with Marcion is you'll say, well, wait a second. Luke does talk about Jesus being born, right? You have the story, of course, John the Baptist. But you get into Luke 3, and you have, Luke 2, the story of Jesus' birth. Well, guess what Marcion does with the Gospel of Luke? He says, I've been commissioned, right, divinely to go and to create the new gospel. And what he does, he excises and says, we're now going to get rid of the first 2 chapters. So he gets rid of the beginning of the Gospel of Luke altogether, and he gives a greatly reduced form of this, and he alters and changes any passages that he feels run against his doctrine or in some way might hint that Jesus actually had a body and actually condescended. And so this is really fascinating. So this is why a number of early Christians say, look, he went about mutilating. Or they said, look, he circumcised, he cut off the gospel. And so he only liked Luke, doesn't certainly like Matthew, because in Matthew, right, Jesus is following the law. So he uses Luke, but only his version of this. And the same appears to be the case with some letters of Paul. He only likes 10 of them. Now, what's interesting here, and I see that we're right out of time, but he becomes incredibly influential. And I think you could make an argument, in fact, what Marcion does with the canon almost certainly influences the larger church at this time. And we think about what Marcion's doing, right? He's basically saying, I'm going to get rid of a lot of Scripture. And again, we're always kind of wondering, what was all the Scripture there? But he kind of reduces this, takes upon himself, saying, look, I've been commissioned. I can now, reduce the Gospel of Luke and do these things with this. I can't help but just think a little bit in the Book of Mormon, talking about Nephi's apocalypse, seeing a day after the beginning of the church and dispensation of Christ where people will begin to remove plain and precious things. And I can't help but think there's something to this with what Marcion is doing, and especially his success with this. There are a lot of implications for this for the next couple centuries. And what I'll hope to do here in the next couple of weeks is spell some of these out, that likely things get removed as a result of Marcion. I see we're right out of time this week, and so we're going to end there. But next week what we'll do is we'll continue working our way into the 3rd century, and we'll see what Christianity is now doing and how it's growing now in new ways as we move into the 3rd century. We're going to also introduce some new church fathers. Have a fantastic week. Stay safe, and I will see you all next week. Take care.